When the Riverside Historical Museum in Ohio received a donation of family photographs from the estate of Martha Kellerman in 2019, curator Dr. Sarah Chen expected to find the usual collection of early 20th century family portraits and snapshots. What she discovered instead was a single photograph from 1911 that would challenge everything historians thought they knew about childhood, family secrets, and the dark realities that could hide behind the most innocent-looking images. The photograph showed two young brothers, 8-year-old William and 6-year-old Henry Kellerman, posed formally in their Sunday best outside their family's farmhouse. But when modern digital enhancement revealed what was hidden around the youngest boy's neck, researchers uncovered a story so disturbing that it had been deliberately concealed for over a century. The photograph had been part of a larger collection of family memorabilia that Martha Kellerman had carefully preserved throughout her 93 years of life. Martha had been the great-niece of the two boys in the photograph, and she had inherited the family's documents and photographs when the last direct descendant had died in the 1970s. For decades, she had kept these materials in a cedar chest in her attic, rarely looking at them, but unable to bring herself to throw them away. When Martha died in 2019, her estate had been settled by a distant cousin who had no interest in old family photographs. Rather than discard the materials, the cousin had decided to donate them to the local historical museum, thinking that they might have some value for researchers studying rural Ohio life in the early 1900s. Dr. Chen had been working through the collection systematically, scanning and cataloging each photograph for the museum's digital archive. Most of the images were typical of rural family photography from the period: formal portraits taken in studios, casual snapshots of family gatherings, and documentation of important events like weddings and graduations. The 1911 photograph of the two Kellerman brothers had initially seemed unremarkable. It showed the boys standing side by side in front of a modest farmhouse, dressed in their best clothes and looking solemnly at the camera. The older boy, William, stood with his hand protectively on his younger brother's shoulder, while Henry looked directly at the photographer with an expression that seemed unusually serious for a 6-year-old child. The photograph had been taken by a traveling photographer who had visited the Kellerman farm in the summer of 1911. Such photographers were common in rural areas during this period, offering families the opportunity to have professional portraits taken without having to travel to distant cities. The photographer had set up his equipment in the farmyard and had taken several photographs of the family, though only this image of the two brothers had survived. Dr. Chen had been impressed by the quality of the photograph and the skill of the photographer who had taken it. The lighting was excellent, and the composition was well balanced, showing both boys clearly while also capturing details of the farmhouse and surrounding landscape in the background. She had decided to scan the image at high resolution to preserve these details for future researchers. It was during this high-resolution scanning process that Dr. Chen first noticed something unusual about the photograph. As she examined the digital image on her computer screen, adjusting the contrast and brightness to bring out details that might not be visible in the original print, she noticed something strange around the younger boy's neck. At first, she thought it might be a shadow or a flaw in the original photograph, but as she enhanced the image further, the anomaly became more pronounced. There appeared to be something around Henry's neck that was partially hidden by his shirt collar and the angle of the photograph, but which became visible when the digital enhancement brought out details that had been too subtle to see with the naked eye. Dr. Chen called in her colleague, Dr. Michael Rodriguez, who specialized in photographic analysis and had experience in examining historical images for signs of damage, alteration, or hidden details. Dr. Rodriguez had developed techniques for using digital enhancement to reveal information that might not be immediately apparent in historical photographs. When Dr. Rodriguez examined the enhanced image, he immediately confirmed Dr. Chen's observation. There was indeed something around the younger boy's neck, and it appeared to be some kind of restraint or binding device. The object was partially concealed by the boy's clothing and the positioning of the photograph, but digital enhancement had revealed enough detail to suggest that it was not a normal piece of clothing or jewelry. The discovery was deeply disturbing. If the object around Henry's neck was indeed some kind of restraint, it would suggest that the 6-year-old boy had been subjected to some form of physical control or punishment that was so severe that it had left visible marks or required the use of restraining devices. Dr. Rodriguez decided to conduct a more thorough analysis of the photograph using advanced digital forensics techniques. He examined the image pixel by pixel, looking for additional details that might help explain what they were seeing, and whether the apparent restraint was genuine or the result of some kind of photographic artifact. His analysis revealed several disturbing details. The object around Henry's neck appeared to be made of metal or leather, and it seemed to be connected to something behind the boy that was not visible in the photograph. There were also what appeared to be marks or bruises on the visible portions of Henry's neck and upper chest, though these were so faint that they were only detectable through digital enhancement. Most disturbing of all, Dr. Rodriguez's analysis revealed that the older brother, William, appeared to be holding something in his hand that was connected to the restraint around Henry's neck. The object in William's hand was partially concealed by the positioning of his arm and the folds of his clothing, but digital enhancement suggested that it might be some kind of chain or rope. The implications of these discoveries were horrifying. The photograph appeared to show a 6-year-old child who was being physically restrained, possibly by his own older brother, in what should have been a simple family portrait. The formal nature of the photograph and the boy's careful positioning suggested that this was not an accident or a momentary lapse, but a deliberate arrangement that had been planned and executed by the adults responsible for the children. Dr. Chen and Dr. Rodriguez realized that they had uncovered evidence of what appeared to be serious child abuse that had taken place over a century ago. The photograph had preserved this evidence in a way that the perpetrators had not anticipated, creating a permanent record of their actions that had survived long after they themselves had died. The researchers decided to investigate the history of the Kellerman family to see if they could find additional information about the circumstances surrounding the photograph and the treatment of the two boys. They began by examining local records, including census data, school records, and newspaper archives from the period. What they discovered was a family history that was far more complex and troubled than the formal photograph had initially suggested. The Kellerman family had been among the early settlers in their part of Ohio, and they had established a successful farming operation that had made them relatively prosperous by local standards. However, the family had also been known for their strict disciplinary methods and their unusual approach to child rearing. Several contemporary accounts describe the Kellerman parents, Johann and Greta Kellerman, as harsh and controlling, with particularly rigid expectations for their children's behavior. The researchers found evidence that the Kellerman children had been subjected to unusually severe punishments for minor infractions, and that the family had been the subject of occasional gossip and concern among their neighbors. However, in an era when parental authority was rarely questioned and physical punishment of children was widely accepted, few people had been willing to intervene or report their concerns to authorities. The most disturbing information came from school records, which showed that Henry Kellerman had frequently been absent from school, and that when he did attend, teachers had noted that he often appeared tired, withdrawn, and sometimes bore visible marks that suggested he had been physically punished. One particularly detailed account came from a teacher named Miss Eleanor Hartwell, who had taught at the local one-room schoolhouse from 1910 to 1915. Miss Hartwell had kept detailed records of her students, including notes about their behavior, academic progress, and any concerns she had about their home situations. Her records showed that she had been particularly worried about Henry Kellerman, whom she described as an intelligent and sensitive child, who seemed to live in constant fear of making mistakes. She had noted that Henry often flinched when adults approached him, and that he seemed to have difficulty concentrating on his lessons, as if he were constantly listening for sounds that might indicate danger. Miss Hartwell had also recorded her observations about the relationship between the two Kellerman brothers. She had noted that William seemed to have been given unusual authority over his younger brother, and that Henry appeared to defer to William in ways that seemed inappropriate for children of their ages. Most significantly, Miss Hartwell had recorded her suspicions that Henry was being subjected to some form of physical restraint at home. She had noted that the boy often wore high-collared shirts even in warm weather, and that he seemed reluctant to remove his outer clothing during physical activities at school. On one occasion, Miss Hartwell had observed what appeared to be marks around Henry's neck when his collar had shifted during a playground activity. She had attempted to question Henry about the marks, but the boy had become extremely agitated and had refused to discuss the matter. Miss Hartwell had considered reporting her concerns to local authorities, but she had been uncertain about what action they might take and had worried that intervention might make Henry's situation worse rather than better. In the end, she had limited herself to documenting her observations and trying to provide Henry with as much support and kindness as possible during school hours. The researchers also discovered that the Kellerman family had been involved in a religious sect that practiced unusually strict forms of discipline and control. The sect, known as the Order of Divine Correction, had been founded by a charismatic preacher named Ezekiel Morrison, who had taught that children were inherently sinful and required constant supervision and correction to prevent them from falling into wickedness. Morrison's teachings had included detailed instructions for the physical restraint and punishment of children, including the use of devices that would prevent them from engaging in sinful behavior even when adults were not present to supervise them. The order had attracted several families in the rural Ohio area, including the Kellermans, who had become devoted followers of Morrison's teachings. The researchers found evidence that Morrison had personally visited the Kellerman farm on several occasions and had provided specific instructions for the treatment of the two boys. He had apparently been particularly concerned about Henry, whom he had identified as being at high risk for sinful behavior due to his sensitive and imaginative nature. Morrison's instructions had included the use of physical restraints that would remind Henry of his need for constant vigilance against sin and would prevent him from engaging in behaviors that Morrison considered inappropriate. These restraints were to be worn at all times except when Henry was sleeping, and they were to be monitored and controlled by his older brother William, who had been designated as Henry's spiritual guardian. The 1911 photograph appeared to have been taken during one of Morrison's visits to the farm, and it seemed likely that the restraint visible around Henry's neck was one of the devices that Morrison had prescribed. The formal nature of the photograph and the careful positioning of the boys suggested that Morrison himself might have directed the composition, intending to create a visual record of his teachings in action. The researchers realized that they had uncovered evidence of systematic child abuse that had been justified and organized by religious extremism. The photograph had preserved a moment that the perpetrators had apparently been proud of, not realizing that future generations would view their actions with horror and disgust. Dr. Chen and Dr. Rodriguez decided to expand their investigation to include other families who had been associated with the Order of Divine Correction. They contacted historical societies and archives in neighboring counties, asking them to search their collections for any materials related to Ezekiel Morrison or his religious movement. Their search yielded disturbing results. They discovered that several other families in the region had been involved with Morrison's sect, and that many of them had practiced similar forms of child discipline and control. Some of these families had also commissioned formal photographs that appeared to document their adherence to Morrison's teachings. One particularly disturbing discovery was a photograph from 1912 that showed 3 children from the Henderson family, all wearing visible restraints and positioned in ways that suggested they were being controlled by adult family members who were not visible in the frame. The photograph had been preserved by descendants who had apparently not understood its significance, viewing it simply as an example of the strict discipline that had been common in their family's past. Another photograph, from the Miller family collection, showed a young girl who appeared to be wearing some kind of device around her waist that restricted her movement. The girl's expression was one of obvious distress, but the photograph had been carefully composed to present the restraint as a normal part of her clothing. These discoveries suggested that Morrison's influence had been more widespread than initially realized, and that the abuse documented in the Kellerman photograph had been part of a systematic pattern of child maltreatment that had affected multiple families in the region. The researchers also found evidence that Morrison's sect had eventually attracted the attention of local authorities, though not because of concerns about child welfare. In 1915, Morrison had been arrested on charges of fraud and embezzlement after it was discovered that he had been taking money from his followers under false pretenses. During the investigation into Morrison's financial crimes, some information about his teachings and practices had come to light, but the focus had been on his theft of money rather than his promotion of child abuse. Several families, including the Kellermans, had been questioned about their involvement with Morrison, but no charges had been filed related to their treatment of their children. The collapse of Morrison's sect had apparently led to changes in the way the affected families treated their children, though the researchers found evidence that some of the abusive practices had continued in modified forms for several years after Morrison's arrest. The fate of the two Kellerman brothers had been particularly tragic. William, the older brother, had apparently struggled with guilt and trauma related to his role in his brother's abuse. School records showed that his academic performance had declined significantly after 1915, and he had become increasingly withdrawn and troubled. Henry, the younger brother who had been the primary victim of the abuse, had suffered even more severe long-term effects. Medical records from the 1920s showed that he had experienced chronic health problems that were likely related to the physical trauma he had endured as a child. He had also struggled with what would now be recognized as symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, though such conditions were not understood or treated effectively at the time. Both brothers had died young. William had been killed in a farming accident in 1923 when he was only 20 years old. Henry had survived until 1931, but he had never married or established an independent life, instead remaining dependent on other family members until his death from what was officially listed as heart failure, but which may have been related to the long-term effects of his childhood trauma. The researchers realized that the 1911 photograph had captured not just a moment of abuse, but the beginning of a tragedy that had destroyed the lives of both children and had had lasting effects on their entire family. The image had preserved evidence of crimes that had never been prosecuted and suffering that had never been acknowledged or addressed. As the investigation deepened, Dr. Chen and Dr. Rodriguez discovered additional disturbing details about the Order of Divine Correction and its practices. They found evidence that Morrison had developed an elaborate theological justification for his methods, claiming that physical restraints and harsh punishments were necessary to save children's souls from eternal damnation. Morrison had written extensively about his beliefs, producing pamphlets and books that outlined his theories about child development and spiritual education. These writings revealed a deeply disturbed individual who had convinced himself and his followers that causing children to suffer was an act of divine love. The researchers found copies of Morrison's writings in several archives, and they were shocked by the detailed instructions he had provided for the construction and use of restraining devices. Morrison had designed specific apparatus for children of different ages and had provided precise guidelines for how long children should be restrained and under what circumstances. The writings also revealed that Morrison had required his followers to document their compliance with his teachings, including taking photographs that showed their children properly restrained and disciplined. This explained why the Kellerman photograph and the other similar images had been taken and preserved. They had been proof of the family's devotion to Morrison's teachings. The researchers discovered that Morrison had operated a workshop where he had manufactured restraining devices for sale to his followers. The workshop had been located in a barn on his property, and it had produced a variety of apparatus designed to control children's behavior and movement. Local newspaper archives revealed that the workshop had been discovered during the investigation into Morrison's financial crimes, but the authorities had apparently not understood the true purpose of the devices they had found. The newspaper reports had described them as unusual mechanical contraptions, without recognizing their intended use for child abuse. The researchers also found evidence that Morrison had trained a group of disciples who had traveled throughout the region, spreading his teachings and helping families implement his methods. These disciples had been responsible for much of the expansion of Morrison's influence and had played key roles in convincing families to adopt his abusive practices. One of these disciples, a man named Samuel Whitmore, had been particularly active in the area around the Kellerman farm. Whitmore had visited dozens of families, providing instruction in Morrison's methods and helping to establish local chapters of the Order of Divine Correction. The researchers found detailed records of Whitmore's activities, including lists of the families he had visited and reports on their progress in implementing Morrison's teachings. These records provided a comprehensive picture of the scope of the abuse that had been occurring in the region and the systematic way in which it had been organized and promoted. Whitmore's records also revealed that he had been responsible for training older children like William Kellerman, to serve as enforcers of Morrison's disciplinary methods. The order had taught that older siblings had a sacred duty to monitor and control their younger brothers and sisters, and Whitmore had provided specific instruction in how to use restraining devices and administer punishments. This explained the disturbing dynamic that Miss Hartwell had observed between the Kellerman brothers. William had not simply been a protective older brother. He had been systematically trained to serve as an agent of his younger brother's abuse, creating a twisted relationship that had damaged both children in different but equally profound ways. The researchers discovered that Whitmore had maintained detailed records of his training sessions, including notes about which children showed the most aptitude for serving as disciplinary agents. William Kellerman had apparently been identified as particularly suitable for this role due to his serious nature and his willingness to follow adult instructions without question. These records painted a horrifying picture of children being systematically turned against each other in service of Morrison's twisted theology. The order had deliberately destroyed the natural bonds of sibling affection and protection, replacing them with relationships based on control, fear, and religious obligation. The investigation also revealed that the Order of Divine Correction had connections to similar movements in other parts of the country. Morrison had corresponded with like-minded religious leaders in several states, sharing techniques and coordinating efforts to spread their methods more widely. One particularly disturbing correspondence was with a preacher in Pennsylvania named Jeremiah Blackwood, who had established his own sect based on similar principles. Blackwood and Morrison had exchanged detailed letters about their methods, including descriptions of new restraining devices and punishment techniques they had developed. The researchers found evidence that children from Morrison's group had been sent to visit Blackwood's community, and vice versa, as part of an exchange program designed to reinforce the teachings of both leaders. These visits had exposed children to even more extreme forms of abuse and had prevented them from developing relationships with adults who might have questioned or challenged their treatment. The correspondence between Morrison and Blackwood also revealed that both men had been aware that their practices were controversial and potentially illegal. They had developed elaborate codes and euphemisms to disguise their activities when writing to each other, and they had taken precautions to avoid detection by authorities. This evidence of deliberate concealment made it clear that Morrison and his associates had known that their actions were wrong, even as they justified them through religious rhetoric. They had been fully aware that they were causing harm to children, but they had continued their practices anyway. Protected by the isolation of rural communities and the reluctance of authorities to intervene in religious matters. The researchers also discovered that the order had developed a sophisticated system for silencing potential whistleblowers. Children who attempted to report their abuse were subjected to even more severe punishments, and adults who expressed concerns were ostracized from the community and threatened with spiritual damnation. The order had also used economic pressure to maintain control over its members. Many of the families involved in the sect had business relationships with each other, and those who questioned Morrison's teachings risked losing their livelihoods as well as their social connections. This system of control had been particularly effective in the rural communities where the order operated. Families were often isolated and dependent on their neighbors for both economic and social support, making it extremely difficult for individuals to break away from the group even when they had doubts about its practices. The researchers found evidence that several families had attempted to leave the order, but had been forced to return due to economic pressure and social isolation. These families had often been subjected to even more severe treatment after their attempted departure, as Morrison and his followers sought to make examples of them to discourage others from similar attempts. The investigation also revealed that the order had operated a network of safe houses where children could be hidden if authorities began to investigate their treatment. These houses had been located in remote areas and had been staffed by devoted followers who were willing to conceal evidence of abuse. The researchers found records indicating that Henry Kellerman had been moved to one of these safe houses on at least 2 occasions when local officials had begun asking questions about his frequent absences from school. During these periods, he had been kept in even more restrictive conditions, as the order sought to prevent him from having any contact with potential rescuers. These safe houses had also been used to house children whose parents had died or abandoned them, creating a population of completely vulnerable victims who had no outside advocates or protectors. The order had claimed to be providing charitable care for these orphaned children, but in reality, they had been subjected to some of the most severe abuse within the organization. The researchers discovered that Morrison had used these orphaned children as test subjects for new restraining devices and punishment techniques. He had justified this by claiming that children without families were at even greater risk of spiritual corruption and therefore required more intensive correction. The records of these experiments were among the most disturbing materials the researchers encountered. Morrison had documented his methods with scientific precision, recording the effects of different types of restraints and punishments on children of various ages and temperaments. These records revealed that Morrison had been fully aware of the physical and psychological damage his methods were causing. He had noted when children became ill, injured, or showed signs of mental distress, but he had interpreted these symptoms as evidence that his treatments were working, rather than as signs that he should stop. The researchers also found evidence that several children had died as a result of Morrison's treatments, though their deaths had been attributed to natural causes or accidents. The order had developed elaborate procedures for concealing evidence when children were seriously injured or killed, including arrangements with sympathetic doctors who would falsify death certificates. One particularly tragic case involved a 7-year-old girl named Mary Patterson, who had died after being restrained for several days as punishment for speaking without permission. The official cause of death had been listed as pneumonia, but Morrison's private records revealed that she had actually died from complications related to the restraining device that had restricted her breathing. The Patterson case had apparently caused some concern even within the order, as several members had questioned whether Morrison's methods had gone too far. However, Morrison had managed to maintain control by claiming that Mary's death had been God's will, and that questioning his methods was tantamount to questioning divine authority. The researchers realized that they had uncovered evidence of what amounted to a systematic program of child torture and murder that had been carried out under the guise of religious education. The scope and deliberate nature of the abuse made it clear that Morrison and his followers had been operating what could only be described as a criminal organization. The investigation also revealed that the order had maintained detailed financial records that showed how profitable their operations had been. Morrison had charged families substantial fees for his services, and he had also sold restraining devices and instructional materials to followers in other regions. The financial records showed that Morrison had accumulated considerable wealth through his activities, much of which he had used to purchase property and expand his operations. He had owned several farms and buildings throughout the region, many of which had been used as training centers and safe houses for the order's activities. The researchers found evidence that Morrison had also invested in legitimate businesses, using his religious organization as a front for various commercial enterprises. This had provided him with additional income and had helped to establish his credibility within the broader community. The financial success of the order had been one of the factors that had attracted new members and had helped to sustain Morrison's influence over his followers. Many families had been impressed by his apparent prosperity and had viewed it as evidence of divine favor for his teachings. However, the financial records also revealed the source of Morrison's eventual downfall. He had become increasingly greedy and had begun embezzling money from his followers more blatantly, eventually attracting the attention of law enforcement officials who had been investigating reports of financial fraud. The researchers discovered that Morrison's arrest in 1915 had been the result of a complaint filed by a former follower who had discovered that Morrison had stolen money that had been donated for the construction of a new meeting hall. The investigation into this complaint had revealed the broader pattern of financial crimes that had led to Morrison's prosecution. However, the focus on financial crimes had meant that the physical abuse of children had largely escaped official attention. The authorities had been primarily concerned with recovering stolen money and had not conducted a thorough investigation into the order's treatment of children. This oversight had allowed many of the abusive practices to continue even after Morrison's arrest, as his followers had maintained their beliefs and had continued to implement his methods under the leadership of his disciples. It had taken several more years for the order to completely collapse, and some families had continued to use Morrison's techniques well into the 1920s, The researchers also discovered that Morrison had attempted to continue his operations from prison, sending coded letters to his followers with instructions for maintaining the order's activities. These letters had been intercepted by prison officials, but they had not understood their significance and had not taken action to prevent Morrison from communicating with his followers. Morrison had served only 3 years in prison before being released on parole in 1918. He had immediately attempted to rebuild his organization, but had found that his influence had waned considerably during his incarceration. Many of his former followers had moved away or had abandoned his teachings, and he had been unable to attract new members to replace them. The researchers found evidence that Morrison had made several attempts to establish new communities based on his teachings, but these efforts had largely failed. He had died in 1925, apparently from natural causes, though some former followers had suspected that he had been murdered by someone seeking revenge for his crimes. The collapse of the Order of Divine Correction had left many of its former members struggling to rebuild their lives and relationships. Families that had been torn apart by Morrison's teachings had found it difficult to reconnect with each other, and many children who had been abused had continued to suffer from the long-term effects of their trauma. The researchers discovered that several support networks had emerged among former members of the order, as people had sought to help each other recover from their experiences. These networks had operated informally and had provided emotional support and practical assistance to those who were trying to rebuild their lives. One such network had been organized by a woman named Rebecca Thompson, whose daughter had been severely abused by the order before Thompson had managed to escape with her to another state. Thompson had dedicated her life to helping other survivors and had maintained correspondence with dozens of former members throughout the 1920s and 1930s. Thompson's letters, which the researchers found in several family collections, provided valuable insight into the long-term effects of the order's abuse and the challenges that survivors had faced in trying to recover. Many former members had struggled with feelings of guilt and shame, and they had found it difficult to trust other people or to form healthy relationships. The letters also revealed that many survivors had been reluctant to speak publicly about their experiences, fearing that they would not be believed or that they would be blamed for their own victimization. This silence had allowed the true scope of the order's crimes to remain hidden for decades, contributing to the lack of historical awareness about Morrison's activities. The researchers realized that their investigation was helping to break this silence and to give voice to survivors whose stories had been suppressed for over a century. The 1911 photograph of the Kellerman brothers had served as a key piece of evidence that had made it possible to document and understand the systematic nature of the abuse that had occurred. The photograph had also provided a focal point for the researchers' efforts to trace the connections between different families and communities that had been affected by the order. By following the trail of evidence that had emerged from their analysis of the image, they had been able to piece together a comprehensive picture of Morrison's organization and its impact on the region. The investigation had also revealed the importance of using modern technology to re-examine historical materials. Without the digital enhancement techniques that had revealed the restraint around Henry Kellerman's neck, the true significance of the photograph might never have been discovered. The researchers realized that their methods could be applied to other historical photographs and documents, potentially revealing additional cases of abuse that had been hidden or overlooked. They began to develop protocols for systematic examination of historical materials, hoping to identify other instances where evidence of crimes had been preserved without being recognized. This work had implications beyond the specific case of the Order of Divine Correction. The researchers had demonstrated that historical materials could contain evidence of systematic abuse, and that modern analytical techniques could be used to uncover this evidence even when it had been deliberately concealed. The investigation had also highlighted the importance of understanding the historical context of child welfare and protection. The case of the Order of Divine Correction had illustrated how religious extremism, social isolation, and inadequate legal protections had combined to create conditions where systematic abuse could flourish. The researchers had found that many of the factors that had enabled Morrison's crimes were still present in contemporary society, albeit in different forms. Religious extremism, social isolation, and inadequate oversight of institutions that serve children continued to create vulnerabilities that could be exploited by those who sought to harm children. This recognition had led the researchers to work with contemporary child protection organizations to develop educational materials that would help people recognize and respond to signs of systematic abuse. They had also worked with law enforcement agencies to develop training programs that would help investigators identify and prosecute cases of institutional abuse. The story of the Kellerman brothers and the Order of Divine Correction had thus become more than just a historical curiosity. It had become a tool for education and prevention, helping to ensure that similar crimes would be less likely to occur in the future and more likely to be detected and stopped when they did occur. The researchers also discovered that the order's influence had extended beyond the immediate region where it had operated. They found evidence that Morrison's writings and methods had been distributed to religious communities in other states, and that similar abusive practices had been adopted by groups that had no direct connection to Morrison himself. This discovery led to a broader investigation into the spread of Morrison's ideas and the ways in which his methods had influenced other religious movements. The researchers found that several contemporary religious groups had incorporated elements of Morrison's teachings into their own practices, often without understanding the full implications of what they were doing. The investigation revealed that Morrison's ideas had been particularly influential among certain fundamentalist Christian groups that emphasized strict discipline and the inherent sinfulness of children. These groups had adopted modified versions of Morrison's restraint techniques and had justified them through their own theological interpretations. The researchers found evidence that some of these groups were still active in the early 21st century, and that they continued to practice forms of child discipline that bore disturbing similarities to Morrison's methods. This discovery had prompted the researchers to work with child protection agencies to investigate these contemporary groups and to ensure that children in their care were not being subjected to abuse. The investigation had also revealed the important role that photography had played in documenting and preserving evidence of the Order's crimes. The formal portraits that families had commissioned to demonstrate their adherence to Morrison's teachings had inadvertently created a permanent record of their abusive practices. The researchers realized that these photographs represented a unique form of historical evidence that had not been fully appreciated by previous scholars. The images had preserved details about the Order's methods and practices that might not have been documented in any other way, and they had provided crucial evidence for understanding the scope and nature of the abuse that had occurred. This recognition had led the researchers to develop new methods for analyzing historical photographs and identifying evidence of abuse or other crimes. They had worked with experts in digital imaging and forensic analysis to create tools that could detect subtle signs of trauma or restraint that might not be visible to the naked eye. The techniques they had developed had applications beyond the specific case of the Order of Divine Correction. They could be used to examine photographs from other historical periods and contexts, potentially revealing evidence of abuse, exploitation, or other crimes that had previously gone undetected. The researchers had also worked with museums and archives to develop guidelines for the ethical display and interpretation of photographs that contained evidence of abuse or trauma. They had recognized that such images needed to be handled with particular sensitivity, both to respect the dignity of the victims and to avoid re-traumatizing viewers who might have experienced similar abuse. The exhibition that the Riverside Historical Museum had developed around the Kellerman photograph had become a model for how such sensitive historical materials could be presented to the public. The exhibition had included extensive contextual information about the historical period and the social conditions that had enabled the abuse to occur, while also providing resources for visitors who might be affected by the content. The exhibition had also included information about contemporary child protection efforts and resources for those who might be experiencing abuse or who were concerned about a child's welfare. This approach had helped to connect the historical content with contemporary issues and had demonstrated the ongoing relevance of the story. The response to the exhibition had been overwhelmingly positive, with visitors expressing appreciation for the careful and respectful way in which the difficult subject matter had been presented. Many visitors had commented that the exhibition had helped them to better understand the historical context of child welfare and the importance of protecting children from abuse. The exhibition had also attracted the attention of researchers and educators from around the world who had come to study the methods that the museum had used to present sensitive historical materials. The exhibition had become a case study in museum ethics and had influenced the development of best practices for displaying difficult historical content. The success of the exhibition had led to the development of educational materials that could be used in schools and universities to teach about the history of child welfare and protection. These materials had been designed to help students understand how attitudes toward children and their rights had evolved over time, and to encourage them to think critically about contemporary child protection issues. The researchers had also worked with social work programs and child protection agencies to develop training materials that used the historical case of the Order of Divine Correction to illustrate important principles of child welfare practice. These materials had helped to train a new generation of child protection professionals who were better equipped to recognize and respond to signs of systematic abuse. The investigation had also led to the discovery of additional historical documents that provided further insight into the Order's operations and the experiences of its victims. Among these was a diary kept by a young woman named Sarah Kellerman, who had been Henry's older sister, and had witnessed much of the abuse that had occurred in her family. Sarah's diary, which had been found in a trunk in the basement of a distant relative's home, provided a first-hand account of life within the Order of Divine Correction. Her entries described the daily routines of restraint and punishment that had been imposed on the children, as well as the psychological manipulation that had been used to maintain control over the family. The diary revealed that Sarah had been deeply troubled by what she had witnessed, but had been unable to intervene due to her own fear of punishment and the religious indoctrination that had convinced her that questioning the Order's methods was tantamount to questioning God himself. Sarah's entries also provided details about the specific restraining devices that had been used on Henry and the physical and emotional effects they had had on him. She had documented his gradual withdrawal from normal childhood activities and his increasing fear and anxiety as the abuse had continued. The diary had also revealed that Sarah had attempted to protect Henry on several occasions, but had been punished severely for her efforts. These punishments had included being forced to watch Henry's abuse without being allowed to intervene, a form of psychological torture that had left lasting scars on both siblings. Sarah's diary had ended abruptly in 1913, when she had been sent away to live with relatives in another state. The researchers had discovered that this had been done at the insistence of Morrison, who had viewed Sarah as a potential threat to his control over the family due to her growing resistance to his methods. The diary had provided crucial evidence for understanding the psychological dynamics within families that had been involved with the Order, and it had helped to explain how the abuse had been able to continue for so long without being reported or stopped. The researchers had also discovered that Sarah had continued to struggle with the effects of her childhood experiences throughout her adult life. She had never married or had children of her own, and she had suffered from what would now be recognized as symptoms of complex post-traumatic stress disorder. Sarah had died in 1967, but not before writing a detailed account of her experiences for her niece, Martha Kellerman, who had preserved the document along with the family photographs. This account had provided additional confirmation of the abuse that had been documented in the 1911 photograph and had helped to fill in many of the gaps in the historical record. The discovery of Sarah's writings had also led to the identification of other survivors of the Order's abuse, some of whom were still alive and willing to share their stories. These interviews had provided valuable insight into the long-term effects of the abuse and had helped to validate the historical evidence that the researchers had uncovered. One particularly poignant interview was with an elderly man named Robert Henderson, who had been one of the children shown in the 1912 photograph that the researchers had discovered. Robert had been in his late 90s when the researchers contacted him, but his memories of the abuse he had suffered were still vivid and detailed. Robert's account had confirmed many of the details that the researchers had pieced together from historical documents, and it had provided additional information about the psychological techniques that the Order had used to maintain control over its victims. He had described the constant fear that had dominated his childhood and the ways in which the abuse had affected his ability to form relationships and trust other people throughout his life. Robert had also provided information about other families that had been involved with the order, helping the researchers to expand their understanding of the scope and impact of Morrison's activities. His testimony had been particularly valuable because he had been old enough during the abuse to understand and remember many details that younger victims might have forgotten or repressed. The researchers had worked with trauma specialists to ensure that their interviews with survivors were conducted in a sensitive and supportive manner. They had recognized that discussing these experiences could be re-traumatizing for the survivors, and they had taken steps to provide appropriate support and resources for those who participated in the research. The interviews with survivors had also provided important validation for the historical research that the researchers had conducted. The survivors' accounts had confirmed the accuracy of the documentary evidence and had provided additional details that had not been preserved in the historical record. The combination of documentary evidence, photographic analysis, and survivor testimony had created a comprehensive picture of the Order of Divine Correction and its impact on the families and communities where it had operated. This multifaceted approach had allowed the researchers to tell the story with a level of detail and accuracy that would not have been possible using any single source of evidence. The research had also demonstrated the importance of taking a holistic approach to historical investigation, particularly when dealing with sensitive topics like child abuse. The researchers had recognized that no single piece of evidence could tell the complete story, and they had worked to gather information from multiple sources to create a more complete and accurate account. The story of the Kellerman brothers and the Order of Divine Correction had thus become more than just a historical case study. It had become a powerful example of how careful research and modern technology could be used to uncover hidden truths and give voice to those who had been silenced by trauma and fear. The 1911 photograph that had started the investigation had served as a key that had unlocked a much larger story about child abuse, religious extremism, and the resilience of the human spirit. The image had preserved evidence of terrible crimes, but it had also provided an opportunity for justice and healing that had transcended the limitations of time. The two brothers who had posed for that photograph over a century ago had finally received the recognition and dignity that had been denied to them in life. Their story had been told with the respect and compassion they deserved, and their suffering had been transformed into a force for education and prevention that would help to protect future generations of children. The photograph would continue to serve as a powerful reminder of the vulnerability of children and the responsibility of adults to protect them from harm. The image had revealed its terrible secret, but in doing so, it had also provided hope that the truth could ultimately prevail over even the most determined efforts to conceal it. The discovery of the truth behind the 1911 photograph had taken the researchers on a journey through one of the darkest chapters in American history, but it had also demonstrated the power of careful investigation and modern technology to uncover hidden truths and provide justice for those who had been wronged. The story of the Kellerman brothers would not be forgotten, and their legacy would live on through the ongoing efforts to protect children from abuse and to ensure that their voices are heard and their rights are respected.